Chapter 1. A Disturbance at Danemead. The village of St. Mary Mead was experiencing one of those perfect June afternoons that seem to exist only in the English countryside. The gardens were in full bloom, a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses, and the villagers went about their business with the comfortable rhythm that had defined life there for generations. Miss Jane Marple sat on the wrought-iron bench in her garden, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what would eventually become a baby blanket for her grandniece's expected child. Her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, perched beside her, enthusiastically recounting the latest village gossip with animated gestures that threatened to upset the tea tray balanced between them. And then, Mrs. Bantry continued, leaning forward, conspiratorially, Mrs. Elmsthwaite told the vicar's wife that she couldn't possibly attend the garden fete if those dreadful Carrington Blakes were to be involved. Can you imagine? After all the trouble poor Mrs. Harmon went through to secure Danemead for the event. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. People rarely change their fundamental nature, Dolly dear. Mrs. Elmsthwaite reminds me so much of my cousin Mabel's daughter-in-law, always taking offence where none was intended. The elderly lady adjusted her shawl despite the warmth of the day. At 83, Miss Marple found that a slight chill seemed to accompany her, regardless of the weather. With her snow-white hair, pink and white wrinkled face, and innocent-looking eyes, she appeared to be the quintessential sweet old lady, a perception that had led many to underestimate her razor-sharp mind. This garden fete at Danemead has caused quite the stir, Miss Marple observed. The Carrington Blakes have only been in residence for 6 months? And yet they've managed to insert themselves into every aspect of village life. Hardly surprising considering their money, Mrs. Bantry said with a sniff, though where it comes from nobody seems entirely sure. Richard Carrington Blake claims to be in international finance, whatever that means these days. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And I understand their niece is staying with them now? The young lady from London. Valerie Stanwick. Yes, arrived last week in that flashy red sports car of hers. Caused quite a commotion outside the post office when she nearly ran over poor Colonel Bantry. He was most upset. Mrs. Bantry took a sip of tea before adding, "Pretty girl, though, in that modern way." The conversation might have continued along these lines had it not been for the unexpected appearance of Miss Marple's gardener's boy, 12-year-old Tommy Wells, who came racing through the garden gate, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple!" he called out, skidding to a halt before her. "There's been an accident at Danemead. Mr. Carrington Blake's been found dead in his study." Mrs. Bantry gasped dramatically, nearly upsetting her teacup. "Dead? Richard Carrington Blake? But how?" The boy shifted from foot to foot. "They're saying he fell down the stairs, but my dad, he was delivering vegetables to the kitchen. He says it wasn't no accident. He says there was blood everywhere, and the police have been called and everything." Miss Marple regarded the boy calmly. "Now, Tommy, we mustn't jump to conclusions or spread gossip. Your father shouldn't be discussing such matters where young ears can hear." Despite her gentle rebuke, a familiar gleam had appeared in Miss Marple's eyes, one that her closest friends would have recognized as interest piqued. She had encountered enough death in her long life to know that accidents, particularly those involving prominent village figures, were rarely as straightforward as they first appeared. The poor man! Mrs. Bantry murmured, though her tone carried a note of excitement rather than genuine sympathy. "And what about the garden fete? It's scheduled for Saturday." "Dolly, really?" Miss Marple chided softly. The sound of police sirens soon confirmed Tommy's report, and within the hour, St. Mary Mead was abuzz with speculation. By tea-time, Miss Marple had gleaned, through a carefully placed telephone call to her friend Inspector Craddock of the County Police, that Richard Carrington Blake's death was indeed being treated as suspicious. Though Craddock had been characteristically tight-lipped about details, his reluctance to dismiss the matter spoke volumes to someone who knew him as well as Miss Marple did. That evening, as dusk settled over her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window observing Tibbs, her elderly tabby cat, who was perched on the garden wall with unusual attentiveness. The cat's gaze was fixed on the lane that led toward Dane Mead, its tail twitching occasionally. "You see something interesting, don't you, Tibbs?" she murmured. "Cats always know when something isn't quite right." She pondered what she had learned throughout the day. Richard Carrington Blake, a man who had arrived in the village with apparently unlimited wealth and obscure origins. His much younger wife, Elaine, a nervous woman who kept largely to herself despite her husband's social ambitions. Their niece, Valerie, whose arrival had coincided with increased tension at Dane Mead, according to Mrs. Carrington Blake's daily help, who happened to be Miss Marple's charwoman's cousin. And then there was the curious matter of the argument overheard by the vicar's wife when she had visited Dane Mead to discuss the garden fete arrangements just yesterday. Something about consequences and responsibilities that had seemed quite heated. "Little pitchers have big ears, as they say," Miss Marple said to herself, "and in a village everyone is listening, whether they mean to or not." As darkness fell, completely, Tibbs suddenly stiffened, then darted away from his perch as though startled. Miss Marple peered into the darkness but could discern nothing amiss. Nevertheless, she felt a familiar sense of disquiet, the same feeling she had experienced at the beginning of several unpleasant incidents in her long life. "I do believe," she murmured to herself as she prepared for bed, "that dear Tibbs has witnessed something important today. And so have I, though I don't yet know what it is." Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a condolence call to Dane Mead. After Dishisha, all it was only proper. And if her visit happened to coincide with the police investigation, well, that would be merely coincidental. Chapter 2. Morning Calls and Afternoon. Whispers the following morning dawned with the peculiar hush that often descends upon a village in the wake of unexpected tragedy. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after a light breakfast, and a brief consultation with her gardener about the state of her prized delphiniums, she set about preparing for what she called her morning calls. "I shall require the blue hat, Cherry," she informed her maid, "and perhaps that grey woolen suit. One must observe the proprieties, especially in times of difficulty." Cherry, a rosy-cheeked young woman who had been with Miss Marple for 3 years, nodded knowingly. "Going to Dane Mead, are you, miss? Everyone's talking about poor Mr. Carrington Blake." "It would be remiss not to offer one's condolences," Miss Marple replied mildly, though the gleam in her pale blue eyes suggested more than mere social obligation. "And I believe Mrs. Bantry mentioned sending over some of her raspberry preserves. I might as well deliver them while I'm about it." By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was making her way along the village high street, nodding and exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces, all while collecting the various fragments of gossip that floated on the morning air. Mr. Ellington at the post office had heard that Richard Carrington Blake had been murdered with a paper knife. Mrs. Hawkins at the bakery swore it was poison, administered by a business rival from London. Young Dr. Rawlins, hurrying past with his medical bag, mentioned that Inspector Craddock was questioning everyone at Danemead and had sent for additional officers from the county headquarters. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Inspector Craddock, himself emerging unexpectedly from the police station as she passed. "I thought I might encounter you sooner rather than later." Miss Marple smiled at the tall, serious-faced detective. "Inspector, how lovely to see you, though the circumstances are most unfortunate." Craddock had long since abandoned any pretense that Miss Marple's interest in murder was purely coincidental. Over the years, her uncanny ability to see through human deception had proven invaluable to him on more than one occasion. "Heading to Danemead, are you?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "A courtesy call only, Inspector. It would hardly be proper to intrude upon your investigation." Craddock's mouth twitched slightly. "Of course not. Well, since you're going, anyway, you might keep your eyes open. There's something not quite right about that household." "Oh?" The wife seems more shocked than grieved. The niece hardly reacted at all, and the staff are being curiously tight-lipped. He paused. "The preliminary medical examination suggests Carrington Blake died sometime between 7 and 9 last evening. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head. Could have been the fall down the stairs, as was first reported, but you have your doubts," Miss Marple finished for him. "Let's just say the pattern of injuries isn't entirely consistent with an accidental fall." As they approached the imposing wrought-iron gates of Danemead, the inspector took his leave. "I'll be back this afternoon to continue questioning. Do let me know if you observe anything of interest." Miss Marple nodded and continued up the long gravel drive, her sensible shoes crunching rhythmically on the stones. Danemead was one of the largest properties in the area, a Victorian manor house that had changed hands several times in recent decades. Its grounds were extensive, but had suffered from neglect until the Carrington Blakes' arrival and subsequent hiring of 3 full-time gardeners. As she neared the house, Miss Marple noticed a young woman sitting on a stone bench beneath a weeping willow, a cigarette held between long, elegant fingers. This must be Valerie Stanwyck, the niece from London. She was striking rather than pretty, with sharp features and dark hair cut in the latest fashion. She wore a black dress that seemed more suited to a cocktail party than a day of mourning. "Good morning," Miss Marple called gently. "I do hope I'm not intruding." Valerie looked up, her expression momentarily unguarded, revealing not grief, but what appeared to Miss Marple to be calculation. It was quickly replaced by a polite smile. "Not at all. You must be one of the village ladies. Aunt Elaine is inside receiving condolences. Miss Marple. Jane Marple. Such a tragedy about your uncle." Valerie took a deep drag of her cigarette. "Yes, isn't it? Though he was my uncle only by marriage. I barely knew him until recently." "Oh? I understood you were staying with them. For the past week, yes. A flying visit that's turned into something rather more complicated." She stubbed out her cigarette on the bench. "I don't suppose the police have mentioned when they'll allow us to leave. I have commitments in London." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "I wouldn't know about police procedures, my dear, but I imagine Inspector Craddock will want to speak with everyone who was present last night." Something flickered in Valerie's eyes. "I wasn't present. I was having dinner with friends in the village. The Harmons, the vicar and his wife. You can ask them if you don't believe me." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of questioning your word," Miss Marple said mildly. "Now, perhaps, I should pay my respects to your aunt." Inside the house, Miss Marple found Elaine Carrington Blake, surrounded by a small group of villagers, including Colonel and Mrs. Bantry. The widow was a thin, nervous-looking woman of about 40, with the faded prettiness of someone who had once been considered a beauty. She clutched a handkerchief and nodded mechanically as various platitudes were offered. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "we were just discussing the dreadful circumstances. Poor Richard was alone in his study when it happened. The maid found him at the bottom of the stairs when she went to announce dinner." "How terrible," Miss Marple murmured, observing the widow carefully. "Mrs. Carrington Blake, please accept my sincerest condolences." Elaine looked up, her reddened eyes focusing with difficulty. "Thank you. It's all been such a shock. Richard was always so careful on those stairs. He often said they were too steep." "Was good, eh? Anyone else at home when it happened?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Just the staff. And the cat, I suppose." A strange expression crossed Elaine's face. Richard's cat, Perseus, horrid creature, always watching. It was sitting at the top of the stairs when they found Richard, just staring. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple spoke quietly with several members of the household staff, noting their varying degrees of surprise, sorrow, and, in the case of the young gardener, what appeared to be relief. She was about to take her leave, when she noticed a fluffy grey Persian cat sitting regally in the window seat of the drawing-room, its amber eyes seemingly fixed on her with unnerving intelligence. "That would be Perseus, I presume," she said to no one in particular. The housekeeper, Mrs. Barton, nodded. "Mr. Carrington Blake's pride and joy. Won't let anyone touch him except the master. Well, former master. Been acting strange since last night, sitting at the top of those stairs for hours, he was." Miss Marple approached the cat cautiously. "Hello, Perseus. You saw something last night, didn't you?" The cat blinked slowly, then turned its gaze toward the door just as Valerie Stanwyck entered, now dressed in a more subdued outfit. The young woman froze momentarily when she saw Miss Marple communing with the cat, then forced a laugh. "Careful, he scratches. Uncle Richard was the only one who could handle him." "Indeed?" Miss Marple smiled innocently. "Animals have such interesting instincts, don't they? They often see things we humans miss entirely." On her walk home, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Dr. Haydock, the elderly village physician, emerging from his surgery. "Ah, Miss Marple, been to Danemead, have you? Terrible business." "Yes, indeed, Doctor. Tell me, did you attend Mr. Carrington Blake before his unfortunate demise?" The doctor hesitated. "Patient confidentiality, you understand. But I can tell you he was in excellent health for a man of 65. No reason to expect a sudden accident." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the cat, Perseus, a beautiful animal. Ah, that cat." Dr. Haydock's expression darkened. "Between us, Miss Marple, Richard Carrington Blake loved that cat more than any person. Changed his will recently, in fact. Left a substantial sum for the animal's care after his death. Caused quite a stir with his wife, I understand. As Miss Marple continued homeward, she pondered this new information. A wealthy man, a much younger wife, a sophisticated niece with London connections, and a cat who had witnessed something important. The ingredients, she reflected, of what might prove to be a most interesting puzzle indeed. Chapter 3. Tea and Suspicions. The afternoon found Miss Marple in her garden once more, this time in the company of Dr. Haydock, who had stopped by ostensibly to check on her rheumatism, but in reality, they both knew, to discuss the matter of Richard Carrington Blake's death. The doctor had been the village physician for nearly 30 years, and had learned to value Miss Marple's insights into the darker aspects of human nature. "Inspector Craddock is calling it murder now," Dr. Haydock said, accepting a cup of Earl Grey. "The autopsy showed the blow to the head was delivered before the fall, not as a result of it. Someone struck Carrington Blake from behind with a heavy object, then arranged him at the bottom of the stairs." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did the inspector mention what sort of object might have been used? "Something with a flat, heavy surface. A bookend, perhaps, or a paperweight. They haven't found it yet." The doctor hesitated. "There's something else. Carrington Blake had traces of a sedative in his system. Nothing that would have killed him, but enough to slow his reactions, make him less likely to fight back or call for help." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And who would have had access to such medication?" Dr. Haydock gave her a pointed look. "Half the village, I'm afraid. I've prescribed similar medications to dozens of patients for insomnia and anxiety. Mrs. Carrington Blake among them." "I see." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she pondered this information. "And what about the cat, Perseus? Has anyone determined who will care for him now? That's become quite the issue, apparently. The will states that Perseus is to be cared for by someone named Michael Saunders, with a generous stipend for the cat's upkeep. No one seems to know who this Saunders fellow is. Certainly not Mrs. Carrington Blake." The telephone rang inside the cottage, and Cherry appeared at the garden door moments later. "It's Mrs. Bantry on the telephone, miss. Says it's urgent." Excusing herself, Miss Marple went to take the call, returning shortly with a thoughtful expression. "Dolly has invited me to tea at Danemead this afternoon. It seems Mrs. Carrington Blake has specifically requested my presence." "Oh?" Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "And why would that be?" "Apparently," Miss Marple said with a slight smile, "she believes I may be able to help her find this mysterious Michael Saunders." Danemead looked different in the afternoon light. Less imposing, more vulnerable somehow. The gardens, which should have been at their summer best, showed signs of recent neglect. Miss Marple noticed several beds of roses in desperate need of deadheading as she made her way up the drive. Mrs. Bantry was waiting at the entrance, practically bubbling with suppressed excitement. "Jane, thank goodness you've come. It's all becoming quite dramatic. Inspector Craddock has been questioning everyone for hours. And wait until you hear what they've discovered about Valerie. Perhaps we should go inside, Dolly," Miss Marple suggested gently. The drawing-room was occupied by a small group. Elaine Carrington Blake, looking even more drawn than earlier. Valerie Stanwyck, now dressed entirely in black, and a middle-aged man Miss Marple hadn't seen before, with a lawyer's briefcase and a lawyer's carefully neutral expression. "Miss Marple," Elaine said, rising. "Thank you for coming. This is Mr. Hargreaves, my late husband's solicitor." Mr. Hargreaves nodded politely. "Mrs. Carrington Blake thought you might be able to assist with a small matter related to my client's will." "I'm not sure how I could possibly help," Miss Marple said modestly, accepting a seat near the window where Perseus the cat still maintained his silent vigil. "It's about this Michael Saunders," Elaine explained, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Richard left £50,000 to provide for his cat, 50,000 to be administered by this man we've never heard of. Mr. Hargreaves has been unable to locate him." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And why did you think I might know of him?" "Because," said Valerie sharply, "Uncle Richard mentioned meeting him through one of your village friends. Some connection to the gardening club or the church bazaar. I can't remember which." Miss Marple turned her attention to the cat, who had risen and stretched languorously before padding across the window seat toward her. "Hello again, Perseus," she said softly. To everyone's surprise, the cat allowed her to stroke his head gently. "Well, I never," said Mrs. Bantry. "That animal hasn't let anyone touch him since Richard died. Animals often sense who can be trusted," Miss Marple observed. "As for Michael Saunders, the name isn't familiar to me, but I could certainly make inquiries." Mr. Hargreaves cleared his throat. "There is some urgency to the matter. The will contains a clause stating that if Mr. Saunders cannot be located within 1 week of Mr. Carrington Blake's death, the provision for the cat's care reverts to Mrs. Carrington Blake, along with the accompanying funds." "How convenient," Valerie murmured. Lighting a cigarette, Elaine shot her a venomous look. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing at all, Aunt Elaine. Just commenting on the situation." The tension in the room was palpable. Miss Marple observed the dynamics with interest, particularly the way Valerie seemed to derive satisfaction from needling her aunt. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "Mr. Carrington Blake might have kept some record of his acquaintances. An address book, perhaps." "The police have his personal effects," Elaine replied. "They've taken his appointment diary and the contents of his desk, something about evidence." Mrs. Bantry, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What about his club? Richard was a member of the Dorchester Club in London, wasn't he? Perhaps this Saunders is a fellow member." "A good suggestion," Mr. Hargreaves noted, making a note in his leather-bound notebook. "I'll make inquiries." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, looking tired but determined. "Afternoon, ladies. Mr. Hargreaves." He nodded to Miss Marple with a hint of a smile. "I'll need to speak with Miss Stanwyck again, if you don't mind." Valerie's composure slipped momentarily. "Again? We've been through this twice already, Inspector." "New information has come to light," Craddock said evenly, "regarding your whereabouts on the night of your uncle's death." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Valerie stubbed out her cigarette with deliberate care. "I told you. I was dining with the vicar and his wife. Yes, until 7:30 according to Mrs. Harmon. But Mr. Carrington Blake died some time after that, possibly as late as 9 o'clock. You didn't return to Dana Mead until nearly 10, according to the staff." "I went for a drive," Valerie said, her voice cool. To clear my head. The country air, you know." "Alone?" the inspector asked. "Yes, alone." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing this exchange, spoke up. "The lanes around here can be quite confusing after dark, especially for someone unfamiliar with the area. Did you happen to get lost, my dear?" Valerie's gaze snapped to Miss Marple, surprised and wary. "As a matter of fact, I did. Took a wrong turn near the old mill and ended up on that dreadful dirt track by the river." "I see," Miss Marple nodded. "That would explain it, then." "Explain what?" Craddock asked sharply. "Why, my gardener's boy, Tommy, saw a red sports car parked near Gossington Hall at around 8 o'clock that evening. He must have been mistaken about the colour." Valerie's face paled slightly. "I'm sure I never went near Gossington Hall." "Course not, dear," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "As I said, Tommy must have been mistaken." After Valerie had departed with Inspector Craddock, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. "Jane, did Tommy really see Valerie's car that night?" "Tommy didn't mention seeing any car at all," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But Miss Stanwix's reaction was most informative, don't you think?" As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the window where Perseus had returned to his vigil. "Such a handsome cat," she remarked to Elaine, "and so devoted to your husband." "Too devoted," Elaine muttered. "Richard cared more for that animal than for any person." "Pets often provide the unconditional affection we find lacking elsewhere," Miss Marple observed mildly. "By the way, Mrs. Carrington Blake, I couldn't help noticing your garden needs attention. The south rose bed is particularly suffering." "Is it?" Elaine seemed disinterested. "The gardeners have been distracted with all this police business, and Richard was the one who cared about the roses, not me." Walking home with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple was unusually quiet, her mind working through the various threads of information she had gathered throughout the day. There was something significant about those roses, something that connected to Richard Carrington Blake's murder and the mysterious Michael Saunders. And then there was Perseus, the cat who had witnessed everything, and who, Miss Marple suspected, held the key to the entire mystery. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Garden. The following day dawned with an unexpected downpour that drummed against Miss Marple's bedroom window, rousing her earlier than usual. She lay for a moment, listening to the rain while organising her thoughts about the Carrington Blake case. "Cherry," she called as her maid brought in the morning tea tray. "I shall need my Wellington boots and mackintosh this morning." "You're not going out in this weather, are you, miss?" Cherry asked, drawing back the curtains to reveal the grey, sodden landscape. "I'm afraid I must," Miss Marple replied, sipping her tea thoughtfully. "There's something about those rose beds, a Dynamite that requires investigation, and this rain may actually prove helpful." After breakfast, Miss Marple set out, properly attired against the elements. The village was quiet, most inhabitants sensibly remaining indoors. As she passed the vicarage, she noticed Reverend Harmon struggling with a recalcitrant garden gate, and paused to speak with him. "Good morning, Vicar. Dreadful weather, isn't it? Miss Marple, what brings you out on such a day?" He abandoned his efforts with the gate and joined her under the shelter of a large oak tree. "I'm on my way to Dynamite, actually. I understand you and Mrs. Harmon had dinner with Miss Stanwick the night of Mr. Carrington Blake's death." The vicar, nodded, his expression troubled. Yes, indeed. A pleasant enough evening, though Miss Stanwix seemed rather preoccupied, kept checking her watch. Did she mention any plans for after dinner? Not specifically. She said something about needing to make a telephone call, but our line was out of order that evening. Tree branch down on the wires. She seemed quite put out about it. I see, Miss Marple murmured. And she left your house at what time? About 7:30. Said she needed to get back to Danemead, but then apparently went for a drive instead. He hesitated. Miss Marple, I don't like to speak ill of anyone, but there was something not quite right about the young lady's manner that evening, almost as if she was establishing an alibi. A natural concern under the circumstances, Miss Marple assured him. By the way, do you happen to know a Mr. Michael Saunders? Mr. Carrington Blake mentioned him in his will. The vicar frowned thoughtfully. Saunders. The name sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it. Have you asked Dr. Haydock? Richard was one of his patients, after all. Miss Marple thanked him and continued on her way, the vicar's words adding another piece to the puzzle forming in her mind. By the time she reached Danemead, the rain had eased to a gentle drizzle. Miss Marple made her way around to the gardens at the rear of the house, where she found one of the gardeners, a weathered man in his 60s, digging dejectedly in the sodden earth. "Good morning," she called cheerfully. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it? I believe you were head gardener at the Langley estate before coming here." The man straightened up, touching his cap respectfully. "That's right, ma'am. 23 years with the Langleys before they sold up. Now I'm here, trying to make sense of this mess. The South Rose bed seems particularly neglected," Miss Marple observed, approaching the area she had noticed the previous day. Johnson's face darkened. That was the master's special project. Wouldn't let any of us touch it. Said he was experimenting with some new varieties. Then, about a month ago, he dug the whole thing up in the middle of the night. Replanted with these standard Queen Elizabeths. Good roses, mind you, but nothing special. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, studying the bed carefully. The rain had washed away much of the soil, revealing what appeared to be fresher earth in several distinct patches. "And you say this happened a month ago?" "Thereabouts, right after that London friend of his visited, the one with the limp." "Edgerton." "Friend from London? Did you happen to catch his name?" Johnson shook his head. "Never heard it. But they spent hours out here talking very serious-like. Then the next day Mr. Carrington Blake had me order all new roses." Miss Marple leaned closer to examine one of the plants. "These don't appear to be very well established, almost as if they were planted quite recently." "Could be," Johnson agreed. "Mr. Carrington Blake was out here the very morning before he died, fussing with the soil. I offered to help, but he sent me away. Quite sharp about it, too." "I see." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Mr. Johnson, if one wanted to hide something in a garden, where would be the most secure place?" The gardener gave her a shrewd look. "For short-term hiding, under a newly planted shrub or rose bush. For something more permanent." He gestured toward a large stone sundial at the centre of the garden. "Underneath something heavy that no one would think to move." Miss Marple thanked him and moved toward the rose bed, her keen eyes scanning the ground. The rain had indeed been helpful, washing away the topsoil to reveal subtle irregularities in the planting pattern. One rose in particular caught her attention. It sat slightly higher than the others, as if the soil beneath it contained something more than roots. Glancing toward the house to ensure she wasn't observed, Miss Marple carefully probed the soil around the plant with her umbrella tip. After a moment, she felt something solid. Working quickly and methodically, she loosened the earth enough to reveal a small metal box, tarnished but intact, buried several inches below the surface. She had just slipped the box into her capacious handbag when a voice called from the terrace. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing out here in the rain?" It was Elaine Carrington Blake, wrapped in an expensive-looking cashmere shawl, looking both startled and suspicious. "Good morning, Mrs. Carrington Blake," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I was just admiring your roses. I'm something of an enthusiast myself, you know. Rain is actually excellent for examining soil quality." "Is it indeed?" Elaine did not sound convinced. "Well, since you're here, you might as well come inside. Inspector Craddock has returned with more questions, and he's been asking for you." Gickery. The drawing-room, Inspector Craddock was interviewing Valerie Stanwyck again, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Miss Stanwyck, witnesses place your car near the old boathouse at approximately 8:15 on the night of your uncle's death. That's less than a mile from Danemead. Yet you claim you were driving aimlessly around lanes you weren't familiar with." Valerie maintained her composure, though her fingers trembled slightly as she lit another cigarette. "I've told you, Inspector. I got lost. I may have passed near the boathouse. I really couldn't say. And you didn't return to Danemead at any point between leaving the vicarage at 7:30 and your documented arrival at 10 o'clock. "No, I did not." The inspector sighed. "Then perhaps you can explain why your fingerprints were found on a glass in Mr. Carrington Blake's study. A glass containing traces of the same sedative found in the deceased's bloodstream." For the first time, Valerie's cool facade cracked. "That's impossible. I haven't been in Uncle Richard's study since I arrived." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Craddock replied grimly. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, spoke up. "Inspector, if I might make a suggestion, perhaps you should ask Mrs. Carrington Blake about her husband's roses." Eyes turned to her in surprise. Elaine Carrington Blake paled visibly. "What about them? Your husband made some rather dramatic changes to the rose bed recently, didn't he? Right after a visit from a gentleman from London, a man with a limp." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elaine said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mrs. E," Marple continued, her manner gentle but persistent. "And then there's the matter of Michael Saunders, the man mentioned in your husband's will, to whom he left the care of Perseus and a considerable sum of money." A heavy silence filled the room. Elaine and Valerie exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "that the answer to both mysteries, the identity of Michael Saunders and the reason for Mr. Carrington Blake's death, may be found in his rose garden. Or rather, what he buried there." Inspector Craddock straightened, his interest piqued. "Mrs. Carrington Blake, did you know your husband had hidden something in the garden?" "Of course not," Elaine snapped, but her hands were shaking now. Richard kept many secrets. That was his nature. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and I suspect one of those secrets involved his true identity. The cat, Perseus, who had maintained his silent vigil by the window, suddenly leapt down and padded across to Miss Marple, rubbing against her ankles with surprising affection. "You see," she continued, stroking the cat gently, "I've been wondering why a man would leave such a substantial sum for the care of a pet, to be administered by a person no one seems to know, unless, of course, the pet itself is the key to finding that person." From her handbag, Miss Marple withdrew the metal box she had unearthed from the rose bed. It was a simple tin cash box, locked but showing signs of recent handling. "I believe this may contain some answers, Inspector, though I dare say we'll need to find the key." As if on cue, Perseus pawed at the ribbon around his neck, from which dangled a small silver key, previously hidden in his thick fur. "Well, well," said Inspector Craddock, looking from the cat to Miss Marple with newfound respect. "It seems our feline friend has been guarding more than just memories." The atmosphere in the drawing-room had changed dramatically. Valerie sat rigid with tension, while Elaine Carrington Blake's face had drained of all colour. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of disturbance in the rose bed where Richard Carrington Blake had buried his secrets that had ultimately led to his death. Chapter 5. The contents of the box. Inspector Craddock carefully took the small silver key from Perseus's collar, the cat allowing this liberty with surprising docility. The room had fallen into a tense silence, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows and Valerie's increasingly agitated tapping of her cigarette case against her palm. "This is absurd," Elaine Carrington Blake finally exclaimed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Breaking into my garden and digging up private property, it's trespassing at the very least." Miss Marple looked at her mildly. "I do apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Carrington Blake. But when murder is involved, certain social niceties must occasionally be set aside." Inspector Craddock inserted the key into the lock of the metal box. It turned with a satisfying click. "I believe we're about to learn something significant," he said, glancing at Miss Marple with something approaching respect, before carefully opening the lid. Inside lay several items: a passport, a small leather notebook, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and what appeared to be an old photograph in a silver frame. The inspector removed the passport first, opening it to reveal Richard Carrington Blake's stern countenance. "But not his name, Michael Saunders," Craddock read aloud, looking up sharply. "Born in Liverpool, 1959. "Let me see that," Elaine demanded, reaching for the passport, but the inspector held it away. "Evidence, Mrs. Carrington Blake." He continued examining the document. "Issued 15 years ago. Multiple entry stamps for Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Miss Marple, who had remained quiet during this revelation, spoke up. So Richard Carrington Blake and Michael Saunders were one and the same person. How very interesting. Dual identity," Craddock mused. "Suggests he might have been hiding from someone, or something." He next removed the photograph, examining it carefully before passing it to Miss Marple. It showed a younger version of Richard Carrington Blake, standing beside a petite blonde woman, both smiling broadly. Between them stood a young girl of perhaps 8 or 9, with the same sharp features now evident in Valerie Stanwyck's adult face. "That's my mother," Valerie said quietly, all pretense abandoned. "And me when I was a child, before the accident." "Accident?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Car crash. Mother was killed instantly. Uncle Richard, or Michael, I suppose, was driving. He walked away with barely a scratch." Her voice had turned bitter. "I was told he left the country afterward. Couldn't bear the memories, supposedly." Miss Marple studied the photograph thoughtfully. "Yet here you are, staying in his house all these years later. That suggests a reconciliation of sorts." Valerie's laugh was hollow. "Reconciliation? No, Miss Marple, recognition. I recognized him the moment I saw his picture in the financial pages 3 years ago. He'd changed his name, his accent, everything, but I knew those eyes. I'd been looking for him for 20 years. Inspector Craddock had turned his attention to the leather notebook, flipping through its pages with increasing interest. "Bank account numbers," he murmured, "offshore holdings, and what appear to be coded references to various business transactions." He looked up at Valerie. "When exactly did you make contact with Mr. Carrington Blake, Miss Stanwick?" "6 months ago. I wrote to him, telling him who I was and what I knew about his past. He invited me to visit." Her composure was returning, a cold mask settling over her features. "He was very accommodating." "Blackmail," Elaine said suddenly, her voice sharp with realization. "You were blackmailing Richard." Valerie shrugged elegantly. "I prefer to think of it as delayed compensation for my mother's death and my own injuries." She gestured to her left leg. "The limp is barely noticeable now, but I spent 3 years in and out of hospitals. And what did you discover about your uncle's past that was worth blackmailing him for?" Craddock asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "That the crash wasn't an accident," Valerie replied, her voice steady, but her eyes glittering with suppressed emotion. "He deliberately drove off that bridge. He wanted to kill both of them, my mother and himself. A suicide pact gone wrong. Or perhaps he changed his mind at the last moment and saved himself instead. But why would they make such a pact?" Miss Marple asked. Craddock held up the bundle of letters. "Perhaps these will tell us." He carefully untied the ribbon and opened the topmost letter, scanning it quickly. "It's from someone at an institution called Blackwood Financial. Dated 23 years ago." He read a portion aloud. "Discrepancies in the accounts must be addressed immediately. If restitution is not made within 30 days, we will have no choice but to involve the authorities." "Embezzlement," Miss Marple said softly. "Mr. Saunders, or Carrington Blake, was in financial difficulties and had taken money that wasn't his. More than difficulties," Craddock continued, examining another letter. "According to this, he'd stolen nearly £500,000 from client accounts. He was facing certain prosecution, disgrace, and imprisonment. So he and my mother planned to end it all together," Valerie concluded, "except he survived, stole a new identity, and eventually rebuilt his fortune, legitimately or otherwise." Elaine had sunk into a chair, her face ashen. "I knew nothing about any of this, nothing." But there was a flicker of something in her eyes that suggested otherwise. Miss Marple turned to her. "When did you first meet your husband, Mrs. Carrington Blake?" 12 years ago, Elaine replied after a moment's hesitation. "In Switzerland. I was working as a tour guide in Geneva. He was on business." "Switzerland," Craddock noted, examining the passport again. "Where Mr. Saunders made frequent visits, according to these entry stamps." And when did you learn of his true identity?" Miss Marple asked gently. Elaine's composure finally cracked. "Only when Valerie arrived 6 months ago. She told me everything, showed me newspaper clippings about the accident, about the investigation into the missing funds. Richard admitted it all. Yet you stayed with him," Craddock observed. "What choice did I have?" Elaine's voice had risen to a near shout. "My name is on half his assets. If his past came to light, I'd lose everything. And then he changed his will, leaving that ridiculous sum to a cat and to this Michael Saunders who didn't even exist anymore." The implications of her outburst hung in the air. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before turning back to Elaine. "Mrs. Carrington Blake, are you admitting to involvement in your husband's death?" "No," Elaine protested frantically. "I'm saying I had a motive, yes, but I didn't kill him. Ask Valerie where she really was that night." All eyes turned to Valerie, who remained remarkably composed. "I told you, I was driving, thinking." "About what?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone conversational. "About your mother's death, about the man who caused it and then prospered while you suffered, about the settlement he finally offered you." "Settlement?" Craddock asked sharply. "It seems likely," Miss Marple explained, "that Mr. Carrington Blake would have attempted to buy Miss Stanwicke's silence. A substantial sum, I imagine, to compensate for both past and present injuries." Valerie's eyes narrowed. £500,000. Exactly the amount he stole all those years ago. Poetic, he called it. "And did you accept this settlement?" Craddock asked. "I was considering it," Valerie replied, her voice cool. "Uncle?" Richard asked for a week to arrange the transfer discreetly. That week would have ended the day after he died. A soft meow interrupted the tense exchange. Perseus had moved to the window seat again and was pawing at something on the sill, a small brass key that had gone unnoticed until now. "What's that?" Craddock asked, moving to retrieve it. "The key to Richard's desk drawer," Elaine said. "The one the police haven't been able to open. He always kept it on the windowsill when he was home. Perseus used to play with it." Miss Marple's eyes lit with sudden comprehension. "Of course, the desk drawer. That's where we'll find the final piece of this puzzle." The group moved to Richard Carrington Blake's study, a sombre wood-panelled room dominated by a large mahogany desk. The drawer in question was on the right-hand side, small but sturdy. Craddock inserted the brass key, and it turned smoothly. Inside lay a single envelope addressed in elegant handwriting to Inspector Craddock or other investigating officer. "He anticipated his own murder," Miss Marple murmured. Craddock opened the envelope and scanned the letter within. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read. "Well?" Elaine demanded. "Mr. Carrington Blake, or Saunders, writes that he feared for his life and wished to record his suspicions should anything happen to him." Craddock looked up, his gaze moving between the two women. "He names both of you as having clear motives to wish him dead, but he specifically mentions that on the night of June 15th, that's 3 nights before his death, he overheard a telephone conversation between you, suggesting a collaboration." "That's absurd," Elaine protested. "Valerie and I barely speak to each other." "In public, perhaps," Miss Marple noted, "but in private, 2 women, both with reasons to wish Mr. Carrington Blake dead, both with much to gain from his demise, it would be natural to consider an alliance. Perseus had followed them into the study, and now sat watching the proceedings with what Miss Marple fancied was a knowing expression. The cat's amber eyes seemed to hold secrets still untold, perspectives no human could access. The cat, Miss Marple said suddenly, was the only witness to what really happened that night. And Richard Carrington Blake knew it. That's why he made such unusual provisions in his will, not out of mere affection for the animal, but because Perseus represented the truth he couldn't speak while alive. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the study with unexpected brilliance. In that moment of clarity, Miss Marple realized she knew exactly what had happened the night Richard Carrington Blake died, and who was responsible for his murder. Chapter 6. Conversations in the Library. That evening found Miss Marple in her cottage, hosting a rather unusual gathering. Inspector Craddock sat in the armchair by the fire, his notebook open on his knee. Dr. Haydock occupied the sofa, while Mrs. Bantry perched eagerly on the window seat, unable to contain her excitement at being included in what she clearly considered the denouement of the investigation. I can't believe you actually found Richard's secret box," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed for the third time. "Buried in the rose garden, of all places. It's just like something from a detective novel." "Life often imitates art, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, mildly pouring tea for her guests. "Though I must say, in my experience, real murderers are seldom as clever as fictional ones." "Speaking of murderers," Inspector Craddock interjected, "I've had both Mrs. Carrington Blake and Miss Stanwick under observation since our discovery this afternoon. Neither has attempted to leave Danemede." "I wouldn't expect them to," Miss Marple nodded. "They're both intelligent women. Flight would only confirm their guilt." Dr. Haydock leaned forward. "Jane, you said earlier that you know what happened the night Carrington Blake died. Are you prepared to share your theory?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "It's more than a theory now, I'm afraid. The contents of that metal box, combined with what we learned from Mr. Carrington Blake's letter, paint a rather clear picture." "And of a conspiracy between the wife and the niece?" Craddock asked. "Yes and no," Miss Marple replied. "There was certainly a conspiracy, but I believe the true sequence of events may surprise you." She turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, do you recall mentioning that Valerie Stanwick arrived in the village in a red sports car?" "Indeed, quite flashy. Nearly ran over the colonel outside the post office. And Tommy Wells reported seeing such a car near Gossington Hall around 8 o'clock on the night of the murder, a time when Miss Stanwick claims to have been driving aimlessly around unfamiliar country lanes." Inspector Craddock nodded. "We found no evidence that she returned to Danemede before 10 o'clock, though her fingerprints were on that glass in Carrington Blake's study." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "And that, I believe, is our first clue to what really happened. Consider, if Valerie wanted to kill her uncle, why would she leave her fingerprints on a glass containing the same sedative found in his system? It would be an extraordinarily careless mistake for an otherwise meticulous person, unless, Dr. Haydock suggested, she wanted to frame someone else. Mrs. Carrington Blake, perhaps." "A possibility," Miss Marple conceded. "But there's the matter of timing. Mr. Carrington Blake died sometime between 7 and 9 in the evening, Valerie left the vicarage at 7:30 and was seen near Gossington Hall at 8. Could she have returned to Danemead, administered the sedative, struck the fatal blow, arranged the body, and then driven to Gossington in that time frame? It would be tight, Craddock admitted, and risky. The staff were still about at that hour. Exactly, Miss Marple nodded. Now, let's consider Mrs. Carrington Blake. She was at home all evening, with no alibi beyond the staff's confirmation that she was somewhere in the house. She had both opportunity and motive, especially after learning about her husband's true identity and the substantial sum he planned to give Valerie. But if she killed him, Mrs. Bantry interjected eagerly, why would she draw attention to Valerie's fingerprints on the glass? An excellent question, Dolly. Miss Marple smiled approvingly. The answer, I believe, lies in that telephone conversation Richard overheard 3 nights before his death. Not a conspiracy to commit murder, but an arrangement of another kind entirely. The room fell silent as her companions waited for her to continue. Outside, the evening had deepened, and Cherry came in quietly to draw the curtains and add another log to the fire. When I visited Danemead yesterday, Miss Marple resumed, I had a brief conversation with the housekeeper, Mrs. Barton. She mentioned something curious, that on the night of the murder she had answered a telephone call for Mrs. Carrington Blake around 7 o'clock. The caller didn't give a name, but Mrs. Barton distinctly heard a woman's voice. Valerie, Dr. Haydock asked. That was my assumption initially. But Mrs. Barton also mentioned that immediately after taking that call, Mrs. Carrington Blake instructed the staff to serve her husband's dinner in his study rather than in the dining room as usual. She claimed he was working on important papers and didn't wish to be disturbed. Inspector Craddock straightened. So she isolated him deliberately. It would appear so. And here's where the cat enters our story again. Miss Marple's eyes took on a distant look, as if she were visualizing the scene. Perseus was found sitting at the top of the stairs when the body was discovered. Mrs. Barton mentioned that the cat had been acting strange all evening, agitated, moving between the study and the main staircase repeatedly. Animals often sense when something is wrong, Dr. Haydock commented. Or, Miss Marple suggested, when someone unfamiliar is in the house, someone who shouldn't be there. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You mean there was an intruder that night? A third person? I believe so, yes. Someone who arrived after the staff had retired to their quarters, but before Valerie returned at 10 o'clock. Someone who Richard Carrington Blake would have admitted to his study without suspicion. But who? Craddock asked, his expression intent. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she gathered her thoughts. When I examined the windowsill in Mr. Carrington Blake's study, I noticed something the police might have overlooked. There were 2 small scratches on the paintwork, fresh ones, as if someone had recently forced the window from the outside. Did find the window unlocked, Craddock admitted, but assumed Carrington Blake himself had opened it. A reasonable assumption under normal circumstances, Miss Marple agreed. But these weren't normal circumstances. I believe someone entered through that window. Someone who had arranged to meet Valerie Stanwyck at Gossington Hall at 8 o'clock, giving them a clear hour to commit the murder and escape undetected. And this mystery person was? Dr. Haydock prompted. I rather think, Miss Marple said carefully, It might have been a former colleague of Mr. Saunders from his Blackwood financial days, someone who knew his true identity all along, perhaps even helped him disappear after the accident, someone who had been quietly blackmailing him for years. "But then why kill him now?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "Because of Valerie's appearance and her demand for £500,000. Mr. Carrington Blake's resources weren't infinite, and if he paid Valerie, he might no longer be able to pay his original blackmailer." Inspector Craddock was making rapid notes. "Do you have any idea who this person might be?" "I believe I do," Miss Marple replied. "When I was examining the contents of the metal box, I noticed something about those letters from Blackwood Financial. They were signed by a J.P. Weatherby, the company's head of security at the time. I asked Cherry to make some telephone inquiries this afternoon, and she discovered that Mr. Weatherby left Blackwood shortly after the Saunders embezzlement scandal. He moved abroad for many years, but returned to England approximately 3 years ago. Around the same time, Valerie recognized her uncle in the financial pages," Dr. Haydock noted. "Precisely. And here's where it becomes interesting. Mr. Weatherby now lives in Milechester, less than 20 miles from St. Mary Mead, under the name James Pettigrew. He breeds Persian cats as a hobby." A collective murmur of understanding rippled through the room. "Perseus," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Richard's beloved cat. A gift, I suspect, from his former colleague. A subtle reminder of their connection and the power Mr. Weatherby still held over him." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "The cat recognized Weatherby that night, which explains why Perseus was so agitated. He was moving between the visitor he knew and his master's body." "But what about Valerie and Elaine?" Craddock asked. "Where do they fit into all this?" "I believe Valerie's appearance in St. Mary Mead was initially genuine. She had discovered her uncle's new identity and wanted compensation. But at some point she made contact with Weatherby, perhaps after realizing her uncle might not pay her what she demanded. And the telephone call to Mrs. Carrington Blake? That, I suspect, was from Weatherby, not Valerie. He convinced Elaine that her husband was planning to leave her, perhaps showed her evidence of the changed will or the offshore accounts. He suggested that if Richard died before finalizing the new arrangements, she would inherit everything. So Elaine's role was to ensure her husband was alone and drugged. Dr. Haydock concluded, yes, the sedative in his evening brandy, a prescription in her name, easily accessible. Not enough to kill him, but enough to make him unable to defend himself when Weatherby arrived, and Valerie's meeting at Gossington Hall. An alibi arranged by Weatherby. He told her to make sure she was seen elsewhere at the time of the murder. Her car is quite distinctive, after all. What better way to establish her innocence than to have a witness place her miles away from the crime scene? Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a decisive snap. It's a compelling theory, Miss Marple. If Weatherby is indeed living in Milechester as James Pettigrew, we can verify his whereabouts on the night in question. I took the liberty of asking Dr. Haydock to telephone the Milechester Veterinary Surgery this afternoon. Miss Marple smiled. It seems Mr. Pettigrew brought in an injured Persian cat on the morning after the murder. The veterinarian noted a cut on his hand, which he claimed he received while trying to treat the cat himself, a cut that might have been sustained during a struggle with Carrington Blake, even in his drugged state, Dr. Haydock added. Or from forcing the window, Craddock mused. This Weatherby character sounds like our man. But I still need concrete evidence linking him to the scene. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reached for her handbag. From it, she withdrew a small envelope. I found this caught in a rose-thorn near the study window at Danemead. It's a receipt from the Milechester Cat Fanciers Society, dated the day before the murder. The name on it is James Pettigrew. As Inspector Craddock took the envelope, Miss Marple added quietly, "You'll also want to examine Perseus's collar more carefully. I noticed a few dark stains on the inside that might well be blood. If it matches Mr. Weatherby's DNA, you'll have your final piece of evidence." Mrs. Bantry stared at her friend with undisguised admiration. "Jane, you never cease to amaze me. How on earth did you put it all together?" Miss Marple smiled modestly. "It wasn't so very difficult, Dolly. The cat was the key all along. Animals are such loyal creatures. They remember those who have been kind to them, and those who haven't. Perseus knew both his master and his master's killer. He was, quite literally, the only witness to everything that happened that night." As her guests prepared to leave, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the darkened garden where her own elderly cat, Tibbs, prowled among the shadows. She wondered what secrets he might be keeping, what silent observations he made of the human dramas that unfolded before his unblinking gaze. "In many ways," she murmured to herself, "cats make the perfect witnesses. They see everything, judge everything, but tell nothing, except to those who know how to interpret their silence." Chapter 7. The Confession. The following morning brought clear skies and a crispness to the air that suggested autumn was not far away, despite the calendar's insistence that summer had several weeks yet to run. Miss Marple was deadheading her. Roses, a task that always helped clarify her thoughts, when Inspector Craddock appeared at her garden gate. "Good morning, Inspector," she called, straightening with only the slightest wince at her arthritic joints. "You're out and about early today." "Good news travels quickly," he replied, accepting her invitation to join her in the garden. "We apprehended James Pettigrew, or J.P. Weatherby, as he was once known, at his home in Milechester late last night." "And did he confess?" Miss Marple inquired, leading the way to the wrought-iron table and chairs beneath her apple tree. "Not immediately," Craddock admitted, settling into a chair. "But when we showed him the receipt you found and mentioned the blood on Perseus's collar, he became rather agitated. Started making all sorts of accusations against Mrs. Carrington Blake and Miss Stanwick." "I imagine he did." Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea from the thermos she'd brought out earlier. "People who commit murder are often quick to implicate others when cornered. He finally broke down around 3 this morning," Craddock continued. "Gave us the whole story, much as you'd pieced together, with a few additional details." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Oh?" "It seems Weatherby didn't just help Saunders disappear after the accident 20 years ago. He actively arranged it, provided the new identity, the initial funds, even the contacts in Switzerland that helped Saunders, now Carrington Blake, establish his new financial empire, in exchange for a percentage of the profits, I presume. 30%, paid quarterly into an account in the Cayman Islands." The inspector shook his head in disbelief. "It amounted to millions over the years. But when Valerie showed up demanding her 500,000, Carrington Blake told Weatherby their arrangement would have to change. He couldn't pay them both. And Mr. Weatherby didn't take kindly to having his income threatened, Miss Marple concluded. Not at all. But here's where it gets interesting. According to Weatherby, Valerie approached him, not the other way around. She'd done her research, figured out the connection between them, and suggested they work together to eliminate her uncle. Miss Marple frowned slightly. That doesn't quite align with what we know of Miss Stanwicke's movements. When would she have had the opportunity to meet with Weatherby prior to her arrival in St. Mary Mead? Apparently they met in London 3 months ago. She'd been tracking her uncle's associates, looking for leverage. When she discovered Weatherby's involvement in the original embezzlement and subsequent cover-up, she saw an opportunity. For revenge rather than mere compensation, Miss Marple murmured. Exactly. The 500,000 was just a ploy. She never expected to receive it. What she wanted was to ensure her uncle paid for her mother's death, one way or another. And Mrs. Carrington Blake, what was her role in all this? Craddock sipped his tea thoughtfully. That's where Weatherby's account becomes less reliable. He insists she was fully complicit, that she provided the sedative and ensured her husband would be alone in his study that evening. But Mrs. Carrington Blake tells a different story. Oh, she admits to administering the sedative, but claims she believed it was merely to ensure her husband slept soundly, while Valerie searched his study for documents proving his true identity. She maintains she had no knowledge of the planned murder. Miss Marple's needles, which had appeared as if by magic from her pocket, clicked thoughtfully. And Miss Stanwicke? What does she say? She's refusing to speak without her solicitor present. But we found the burner phone she used to communicate with Weatherby and text messages confirming their meeting at Gossington Hall on the night of the murder. She was there to provide him with the layout of Danemead and to verify when the staff had retired. Which explains why Tommy saw her car there. Miss Marple nodded. Poor woman! To carry such hatred for so many years. Poor woman! Craddock raised an eyebrow. She conspired to commit murder, Miss Marple. Oh, I don't excuse her actions, Inspector, but I can understand the pain that drove them. To lose her mother so young, and then to discover the man responsible had prospered while she suffered, it would twist anyone's perspective. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who hurried through the garden gate in a state of considerable excitement. Jane, have you heard? They've arrested that Weatherby man from Milechester. And Valerie Stanwicke, too. It's all over. The village. The inspector was just telling me, Miss Marple replied calmly. Do sit down, Dolly. There's plenty of tea. Mrs. Bantry joined them, barely pausing for breath. And what about Elaine Carrington Blake? Is she to be charged as well? That remains to be determined, Craddock said. The evidence against her is largely circumstantial. Without a clear confession from either Weatherby or Miss Stanwicke implicating her directly in the murder plot, it would be difficult to prove she intended her husband's death rather than merely the discovery of his secrets. But surely drugging one's husband is a crime in itself, Mrs. Bantry pressed. Possibly, Craddock conceded, though she claims the sedative was something he took regularly for anxiety, and she merely ensured he had his usual dose that evening. Miss Marple set down her knitting. What about Perseus? What's to become of the cat now? Ah, there's an interesting development on that front. Craddock smiled. It turns out Richard Carrington Blake's will was more cleverly worded than we initially thought. The provision for the cat's care specified that if Michael Saunders couldn't be located, the responsibility would fall to the person who discovers the truth about my death. "Which would be you, Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "You're to inherit Perseus and £50,000. Miss Marple looked startled. "Oh dear, I couldn't possibly—" "The solicitor is quite clear on the matter," Craddock assured her. "Carrington Blake anticipated his murder and set up this provision deliberately. He knew his wife wouldn't care for the animal, and he must have suspected both she and his niece might be involved in any attempt on his life." "But what am I to do with a Persian cat?" Miss Marple wondered. "Tibbs is rather set in his ways. I'm not sure he'd welcome a companion at this stage of his life." "Perhaps," Mrs. Bantry suggested eagerly, "you could allow me to care for Perseus. The Colonel has always wanted a pedigree cat, and Gossington Hall has plenty of space." Miss Marple considered this. That might be a reasonable solution, provided the terms of the will permit such an arrangement. "And I'm sure Perseus would prefer a country estate to my modest cottage." As they discussed the practicalities, Cherry appeared at the garden door. "Telephone for you, miss. It's Dr. Haydock." Miss Marple excused herself and went inside to take the call. When she returned several minutes later, her expression was grave. "It seems there's been yet another development," she announced. "Dr. Haydock has just examined Elaine Carrington Blake, who collapsed at Danemead this morning. She suffered what appears to be a mild heart attack brought on by stress." "Good heavens!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "Is she in danger?" "Not immediate danger, no, but in her distressed state she made what amounts to a confession. She admitted to Dr. Haydock that she knew of the plot to kill her husband and did nothing to prevent it. In fact, she claims to have suggested the use of the sedative herself, knowing it would make him vulnerable." Inspector Craddock stood immediately. "I should get to the hospital." "Dr. Haydock thought you might say that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He's already arranged for a police constable to be posted outside her room, but he suggests giving her until this afternoon to recover somewhat, before questioning her." Craddock nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but I'll need a formal statement as soon as she's able." After the inspector had departed, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with undisguised curiosity. "What do you make of it all, Jane? 3 people conspiring to kill one man. It's like something from a Greek tragedy." "I think," Miss Marple replied slowly, "that Richard Carrington Blake, or Michael Saunders, spent 20 years running from his past only to have it catch up with him in the most terrible way. He created a new identity, a new fortune, even a new marriage, but he couldn't escape the consequences of his original crimes. And now all 3 conspirators will face justice." Mrs. Bantry nodded with satisfaction. "Yes, though in different degrees, I expect. Mr. Weatherby struck the fatal blow. Miss Stanwick orchestrated the plot. Mrs. Carrington Blake enabled it. All guilty, but perhaps not equally so in the eyes of the law." As they sat in contemplative silence, Miss Marple noticed a distinctive grey shape making its way along her garden wall. Perseus, apparently having escaped from Danemead in the confusion following his mistress's collapse. The cat paused, regarding Miss Marple with those intelligent amber eyes, then leapt gracefully down into her garden. "Well?" she said softly, as the animal approached and settled regally at her feet. "It seems I have a new responsibility, whether I planned for one or not." Perseus blinked slowly up at her, a gesture she knew cats reserved for those they trusted. In that moment, Miss Marple felt a curious kinship with this feline witness to murder and deception. They were both observers of human nature, both underestimated by those around them, and both, in their different ways, instruments of justice. "I think," she told Mrs. Bantry, watching as Perseus began to groom his immaculate fur, "that this particular cat and I will understand each other very well indeed." Chapter 8. A Visit to the Hospital. The afternoon found Miss Marple carefully making her way up the steps of Milechester General Hospital, a modest bouquet of late summer flowers from her garden clasped in one gloved hand. Perseus had been temporarily installed at Gossington Hall under Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic care, leaving Miss Marple free to follow up on what she considered the final loose ends of the case. The hospital corridors were hushed, with the faint antiseptic smell that Miss Marple had always found both reassuring and slightly unsettling. At the nurse's station, she inquired after Mrs. Carrington Blake and was directed to a private room on the second floor. A young constable sat outside, looking bored but attentive. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he asked, standing as she approached. "Inspector Craddock mentioned you might be stopping by. Mrs. Carrington Blake has already given her statement, but the doctor says she's well enough for a short visit." "Thank you, Constable," Miss Marple replied. "I won't stay long." She knocked gently on the door before entering. The room was pleasantly appointed, with sunlight streaming through Venetian blinds, creating striped patterns across the bed, where Elaine Carrington Blake reclined against several pillows. She looked pale but composed, her hospital gown a stark contrast to the elegant attire Miss Marple had previously seen her wearing. "Miss Marple," she said with obvious surprise. "I didn't expect visitors, especially not you." "Sometimes," Miss Marple replied, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "It's easier to speak with someone who is neither family nor police. How are you feeling?" Elaine gave a small, bitter laugh. "Physically, better than I deserve. Dr. Haydock says it was a mild attack, brought on by stress. Emotionally? I'm not sure I can answer that." Miss Marple settled into the chair beside the bed. "I understand you've made a formal statement to Inspector Craddock." "Yes." Elaine's fingers twisted the edge of her sheet. "I've admitted everything. My role in Richard's death, my knowledge of Valerie and Weatherby's plan. There didn't seem much point in denying it anymore." "May I ask why you decided to confess now?" Elaine was silent for a moment, looking out at the sliced sunlight. "When they took me away from Danemead yesterday, I caught a glimpse of Richard's study door as we passed. It was standing open, and I could see Perseus sitting just inside, watching me with those knowing eyes. In that moment, I felt as if Richard himself was looking at me, aware of everything I'd done." She shivered slightly. "It sounds foolish, I know." "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "Guilt has many ways of making itself known to us. I didn't want him dead, not at first," Elaine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Valerie arrived and revealed Richard's true identity, I was shocked, angry, but not murderous. It was only when I discovered he'd changed his will, leaving that absurd sum for the cat, and nothing specified for me beyond the joint assets, that I began to fear for my future." And that's when Weatherby contacted you?" Elaine nodded. "He called one evening when Richard was out. Said he was an old associate of Michael Saunders and had information that might interest me. We met in Milechester the next day. He showed me records of Richard's offshore accounts, funds I knew nothing about. He suggested that Richard was planning to disappear again, to abandon me as he had abandoned his previous life." "And you believed him?" It made a terrible kind of sense. Richard had been distant for weeks, ever since Valerie's arrival. He'd spent hours in his study with the door locked, or out in that wretched rose garden. And then there was the changed will. She trailed off, lost in recollection. "So when Weatherby proposed eliminating your husband, you agreed?" "Not immediately." Elaine's voice strengthened slightly. "I told him I needed time to think. But then Valerie approached me directly. She said she had proof that Richard was liquidating assets, preparing to flee. She showed me emails, bank transfers. Between them, they convinced me I had no choice." Miss Marple observed her carefully. "And your role was to ensure your husband was drugged and alone that evening?" "Yes. I added an extra dose of his sedative to his after-dinner brandy. I told the staff he wanted to dine alone in his study. I made sure the window was unlocked." Elaine's clinical recitation of these facts suggested she had distanced herself emotionally from her actions. "Weatherby did the rest. He came through the garden, entered through the study window, and—" She stopped abruptly. "And Valerie's part? She provided the alibi for Weatherby, made sure she was seen driving around the area, far from Danemead. She was supposed to return late, discover the body, and raise the alarm. But the maid found him first." Elaine closed her eyes briefly. "It all went according to plan, except for that wretched cat. Richard never let Perseus out of the study when he was working, but somehow the animal slipped out and was sitting at the top of the stairs when they found the body." "Where he had witnessed everything," Miss Marple murmured. "Another of Richard's precautions, I suppose. He always said that Cat was the only living creature he truly trusted." A tear slipped down Elaine's cheek. How ironic that in the end he was right. There was a gentle knock at the door, and Dr. Haydock entered, eyebrows raising slightly at the sight of Miss Marple. "I might have known you'd be here, Jane," he said with a small smile, "but I'm afraid I must ask you to cut your visit short. Mrs. Carrington Blake needs rest." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, rising. "I was just leaving." As she gathered her things, Elaine reached out suddenly, catching Miss Marple's wrist with surprising strength. "There's something else," she said urgently. "Something I haven't told the police about Valerie." Miss Marple paused. "Yes? She's not who she claims to be. I found a passport in her room after the police took her away. It's in a different name, entirely. Caroline Withers. I have no idea who she really is or what her connection to Richard might have been." Before Miss Marple could respond, Elaine released her wrist and turned away. "It doesn't matter now, I suppose. We'll all pay for what we've done, one way or another." In the corridor outside, Dr. Haydock accompanied Miss Marple towards the elevator. "Well, Jane, what do you make of that final revelation?" "It's most interesting," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "If true, it suggests this entire affair may be even more complex than we initially believed." She pressed the elevator button and added, "I think I shall pay a visit to Inspector Craddock on my way home. This new information about Miss Stanwyck or Miss Withers may be significant. You never truly retire from detection, do you? Dr. Haydock observed with a fond smile. One never retires from observing human nature, Doctor, Miss Marple corrected gently. The patterns remain the same, even when the players change. The elevator arrived, and as the doors slid open, Miss Marple added, "And speaking of players, I should check on Perseus when I return. Cats, like people, reveal their true nature in times of stress. I'm most curious to see how he's adjusting to his new circumstances." Inspector Craddock's office at the police station was a model of organised chaos. Files and papers in seemingly haphazard piles that nonetheless made perfect sense to their owner. He looked up from his desk as Miss Marple was shown in, his expression brightening. "Miss Marple, I was hoping you'd stop by. I've just been reviewing the statements from our 3 conspirators. A most extraordinary case." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, settling into the offered chair. "And one that continues to present new mysteries. I've just come from visiting Mrs. Carrington Blake at the hospital." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "And?" "She told me something rather startling about Valerie Stanwyck. According to Mrs. Carrington Blake, Valerie is not her real name. She claims to have found a passport in the young woman's room under the name Caroline Withers." The inspector leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "That would explain a few inconsistencies we've encountered. We've been trying to verify Miss Stanwyck's background, and there are some gaps that have proved difficult to fill. Have you been able to question her further?" "Not yet. Her solicitor has been most obstructive, but this new information may give us the leverage we need." He made a note on his pad. "I'll have someone check into this Caroline Withers immediately." "There's something else that's been troubling me," Miss Marple continued. "The timing of Mr. Weatherby's reappearance in Richard Carrington Blake's life. It seems too convenient that he should resurface just as Valerie or Caroline tracked down her." "Uncle," Craddock nodded, "I've been thinking the same thing. The probability of 2 people from Saunders' past independently finding him after 20 years seems rather low." "Unless they were working together from the beginning," Miss Marple suggested. "Mr. Weatherby admitted to helping Richard Carrington Blake establish his new identity after the accident. He would have known all the details of that incident, including the fact that a child survived. You think Weatherby might have located the daughter, Valerie, and recruited her for his scheme? Or," Miss Marple said carefully, "he might have found someone willing to pose as the daughter. Someone with similar physical characteristics, perhaps with acting experience. The real Valerie Stanwyck might have died years ago, or she might be living somewhere entirely unaware of this impersonation." Craddock's eyes widened slightly. "That would elevate this from murder to an elaborate long con. Weatherby's revenge for being cut out of the profits after helping Saunders disappear." "Precisely. And if Caroline Withers is indeed an impostor, her investment in this scheme would have been considerable, learning the details of Valerie's childhood, practicing her mannerisms, even creating a convincing limp to match the injuries sustained in the accident." The inspector was already reaching for his telephone. "I need to get a team on this immediately. If you're right, Miss Marple, we may be looking at a much broader conspiracy than we initially thought." As Craddock made his calls, Miss Marple gazed out the window at the peaceful village street below. She was reminded of a case from her youth, involving identical twins and a disputed inheritance. Human nature, she reflected, had changed very little in all her years of observation. Greed, revenge, jealousy, these fundamental motivations remained constants, even as the methods of deception grew more sophisticated. When the inspector had finished his calls, he turned back to Miss Marple with newfound respect in his eyes. We should have preliminary information on Caroline Withers within the hour. In the meantime, I've instructed the officers at Danemead to search Miss Stanwicke's room more thoroughly. If there's anything else hidden there, we'll find it. Good. Miss Marple nodded. And Perseus, has he provided any further clues to this puzzle? Craddock smiled slightly. The cat? No, I'm afraid his testimony, while doubtless valuable, remains inadmissible in court. But speaking of Perseus, I've been meaning to ask, what do you intend to do with him, and with the rather substantial inheritance that accompanies him? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I have some thoughts on that matter, Inspector. But first, let's see what we discover about the mysterious Caroline Withers. I have a feeling that Perseus may have witnessed even more than we initially suspected. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple added, You know, Inspector, in all my years of observing human nature, I've found that people who construct elaborate deceptions often leave the most revealing clues in plain sight. It's not the locked drawers or hidden compartments one should examine, but the objects displayed openly, whose significance is obscured by familiarity, such as a Persian cat named Perseus, the Greek hero who slew Medusa, a rather pointed choice of name for a pet belonging to a man who had faked his own death and was living under an assumed identity, don't you think? With that enigmatic observation, Miss Marple took her leave, her mind already turning to the final pieces of this intricate puzzle and to the silent, watchful cat who had witnessed everything. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Never Was. The golden light of late afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead in a honeyed glow as Miss Marple made her way to Gossington Hall to check on Perseus. The events of the day had given her much to consider, and the gentle walk through familiar lanes provided a welcome opportunity to arrange her thoughts. Mrs. Bantry greeted her with characteristic enthusiasm, ushering her into the drawing-room where Perseus had established himself regally on a velvet cushion by the fireplace. He's settled in remarkably well, Mrs. Bantry reported. The Colonel is quite taken with him, says he has military bearing, though I must say, Jane, he does have the most disconcerting way of staring, as if he's judging one's every move. Cats are natural observers, Miss Marple replied, watching, as Perseus acknowledged her presence with a slow blink. Much like detectives, they note the small inconsistencies in behaviour that others might miss. Speaking of inconsistencies, Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. Though they were alone in the room, I've had the most intriguing telephone call from Inspector Craddock. He asked if I recalled anything unusual about Valerie Stanwicke's first appearance in the village. Said it might be important to the case. And did you? Miss Marple inquired, accepting a cup of tea from her friend. Well, now that he mentions it, there was something. Mrs. Bantry settled beside her on the sofa. The day she arrived in that flashy red car, she stopped at the post office to ask directions to Danemead. Mrs. Ellington mentioned afterward that she seemed oddly uncertain for someone visiting family, asked how to address the vicar's wife, and whether the local shops were open on Wednesday afternoons. The sort of questions a tourist might ask, not a niece visiting her uncle. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. An actress preparing for a role might seek such details. An actress? Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. Jane, what aren't you telling me? Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of the Colonel, who entered bearing a telegram on a small silver tray. For you, Miss Marple, he announced. Just delivered by the boy from the post office. Said it was marked urgent. Miss Marple opened the telegram with steady fingers, though her heart quickened slightly at its contents. It's from Inspector Craddock, she explained. They've found information about Caroline Withers. She was indeed an actress, a minor one with the Thornfield Repertory Company until 3 years ago. And after that, Mrs. Bantry prompted eagerly. She disappeared from public record until reappearing in London 6 months ago, shortly before. Valerie Stanwyck made contact with Richard Carrington Blake. Miss Marple folded the telegram carefully. The inspector asks if I would be willing to attend the questioning of Miss Withers tomorrow morning. Apparently, she's requesting to speak with me. With you? Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. But why? I can't imagine, Miss Marple replied, though the slight furrow in her brow suggested otherwise. But I shall certainly oblige. The Colonel, who had been listening with increasing interest, cleared his throat. Forgive me, Miss Marple, but this all sounds rather dangerous. This woman, whoever she is, was involved in a murder. Are you quite sure it's wise to meet with her? It will be at the police station, Colonel, with Inspector Craddock present. I shall be perfectly safe. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, though her eyes remained thoughtful. Besides, I find I'm most curious to hear what she has to say. After finishing her tea and spending some time observing Perseus, who had maintained a dignified aloofness throughout the conversation, Miss Marple took her leave, promising to telephone Mrs. Bantry with any developments after the interview. The walk home through the deepening twilight gave her ample opportunity to consider the curious request from Caroline Withers. What could the woman possibly want from her? Miss Marple had been instrumental in unravelling the conspiracy that would likely send her to prison for many years. There seemed little reason for her to seek a conversation. Unless, of course, there was yet another layer to this mystery, one that even Miss Marple had not yet discerned. The following morning found Miss Marple at the Milechester police station, being escorted by Inspector Craddock to an interview room in the building's quieter rear section. She's been most insistent about speaking with you, Craddock explained as they walked. Won't say why, but she claims it concerns evidence relevant to the case that only you would understand. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured. Has she confirmed her true identity? Yes, she's admitted to being Caroline Withers, an actress hired by Weatherby to impersonate Valerie Stanwyck. According to her statement, the real Valerie died of complications from her injuries 5 years after the accident. Weatherby discovered this while keeping tabs on Saunders' past connections, and conceived the idea of using an impostor to approach Carrington Blake. Her performance was quite convincing, Miss Marple observed. The limp, the emotional reactions, when discussing her mother's death, all very skillfully executed. She is a professional after all, Craddock replied dryly, though I doubt she anticipated her role would extend to a murder charge. They had reached the interview room, a spare, functional space containing a table and 3 chairs. Caroline Withers, no longer presenting herself as Valerie Stanwyck, sat on the far side, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face devoid of makeup. Without the carefully cultivated appearance of the grieving niece, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Miss Marple," she said as they entered, her voice lacking the cultured tones she had previously affected. "Thank you for coming." "Miss Withers," Miss Marple acknowledged, taking a seat opposite her. "I understand you wish to speak with me specifically." "Yes." Caroline glanced at Inspector Craddock, who had positioned himself by the door. "It's about Perseus." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow slightly. "The cat?" "Not just any cat." Caroline leaned forward, her expression intense. "Do you know why Richard, Mr. Carrington Blake, named him Perseus?" "I had assumed it was a classical reference," Miss Marple replied. "Perseus, the Greek hero who slew Medusa." "Partly, yes, but it was more personal than that. Perseus was his sister's name for him when they were children. Per, she called him for short. When Richard acquired the cat 3 years ago, he gave it that name as a private memorial." "I wasn't aware Mr. Carrington Blake had a sister," Miss Marple said carefully. "Few people were. She died young, tuberculosis, but she was the only person who ever truly loved him, according to Weatherby." Caroline's gaze was steady now. That's why the provision in the will was so specific. Michael Saunders wasn't just Richard's former identity. It was a tribute. His sister's name was Michelle Saunders. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "And you believe this is significant to the case?" "I believe it explains why Richard was so susceptible to my portrayal of his long-lost niece. He'd already lost one family member he loved. The chance to reconnect with another, even one who had reason to resent him, was irresistible. Yet you used that vulnerability to participate in his murder," Craddock interjected from his position by the door. Caroline's shoulders slumped slightly. "I didn't know murder was the plan, not at first. Weatherby hired me to play a role, the vengeful niece seeking compensation. He said it was part of a scheme to recover funds that Carrington Blake had stolen from him." "And you believed him?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I wanted to believe him. The money he offered was substantial, and my career was going nowhere by the time I realized what he actually intended." She trailed off, then straightened. "But that's not why I asked to speak with you, Miss Marple. There's something else. Something about the cat and what he witnessed." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged when Caroline hesitated. "The night of the murder, I was indeed at Gossington Hall at 8 o'clock, as your gardener's boy reported. But I didn't stay there. After confirming that Weatherby had entered Danemead through the study window, I drove back myself and parked some distance away. I wanted to ensure he didn't—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Exceed our agreement." "You went to the house?" Craddock asked sharply. Caroline nodded. "I entered through the kitchen garden. The staff were all in their quarters at the rear of the house, and Elaine was in her room with a migraine, a convenient ailment she developed whenever Richard worked late." "And what did you witness?" Miss Marple inquired. "I saw Weatherby emerge from the study. He was wearing gloves and carrying something wrapped in a cloth. The murder weapon, I presume. He didn't see me. I was hidden behind the conservatory door. But Perseus saw me. The cat was sitting on the landing watching everything. When Weatherby had gone, I went to the study myself. You entered the room where the murder had just taken place? Miss Marple's tone remained neutral, but her gaze sharpened. Yes, I wanted to see if Richard was truly dead, if Weatherby had actually gone through with it. Caroline's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. He was lying at the bottom of the stairs, just as they found him later. But there was something else, something the police apparently overlooked. A small digital recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews, partially hidden under his body. Inspector Craddock straightened. A recorder? It wasn't in the evidence collected from the scene. Because I took it, Caroline admitted. I played it back right there, with Perseus watching me from the doorway. Richard had been recording his conversation with Weatherby. He suspected something might happen. He'd become increasingly paranoid in the weeks after I arrived. And what was on this recording? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Everything. Weatherby's confession that he'd been blackmailing Richard for years. His threats when Richard said he couldn't continue paying. His admission that Valerie was an actress he'd hired to add pressure. Caroline reached into her pocket and withdrew a small black device. I've kept it all this time, as insurance, I told myself. But really, I think I was afraid to acknowledge my part in what happened. Inspector Craddock stepped forward to take the recorder, his expression grim. This is vital evidence, Miss Withers. Why didn't you come forward with it immediately? Because it incriminates me too, she replied simply. Not in the murder itself, but in the deception that led to it. And because, she hesitated looking at Miss Marple, because I wanted to understand why Perseus was so important to him, why he made such elaborate provisions for a cat. And now you know, Miss Marple said softly. He was preserving the memory of the only person who had loved him unconditionally. As Inspector Craddock examined the recorder, Caroline leaned closer to Miss Marple. There's one more thing, she said, her voice low. Something only the cat witnessed. After I found the recorder and listened to it, I heard someone coming. I hid in the study closet. It was Elaine. She came in, looked at Richard's body, and then did something unexpected. She searched his pockets until she found a small key, which she took. Then she whispered something, to him, or perhaps to herself. I couldn't hear what it was, but Perseus was watching her too, from his place on the landing. A key, Miss Marple mused. To what, I wonder? I don't know, but it seemed important to her, important enough to risk being discovered with her husband's body before raising the alarm. As Caroline finished her account, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence, connecting this new information with the pattern she had been assembling in her mind. The mystery had deepened in unexpected ways, but at its core remained the fundamental human emotions she had observed throughout her long life: greed, fear, loneliness, and the desperate need for connection. And through it all, Perseus had watched, with those knowing amber eyes, a silent witness to the human drama unfolding around him, a drama that was still, it seemed, reaching toward its final act. Chapter 10. The Hidden Key. The revelation about the key had given Miss Marple much to consider. After leaving the police station, she found herself walking not toward her cottage, but in the direction of Danemead. The imposing house looked different now, less a symbol of wealth and status than a repository of secrets. each room potentially holding another piece of the puzzle she was determined to solve. A police constable stood guard at the entrance, but he recognized Miss Marple immediately, and after a brief telephone consultation with Inspector Craddock, permitted her to enter. The house felt strangely empty, its normally bustling staff reduced to a skeletal crew who moved about their duties with subdued efficiency. Mrs. Barton, the housekeeper, greeted Miss Marple in the entrance hall, her usually composed demeanour showing signs of strain. "Such a terrible business, miss," she said, wringing her hands slightly. "I've been with the family for 6 years and never suspected anything amiss, though I must say the master did seem increasingly anxious these past few months." "Change often creates anxiety, Mrs. Barton," Miss Marple observed mildly. And Mr. Carrington Blake had experienced quite a significant change with the arrival of his niece, or rather, the woman claiming to be his niece. Indeed, to think she was an actress all along. The housekeeper shook her head in disbelief. Makes one wonder what else might have been false. "I was wondering," Miss Marple said, carefully changing the subject, "if you might show me Mrs. Carrington Blake's private sitting room. Inspector Craddock has asked me to look for anything that might be relevant to the investigation." This wasn't entirely accurate, but Miss Marple had found that a small stretching of the truth was sometimes necessary in pursuit of justice. "Of course, miss, though the police have already been through everything quite thoroughly." Mrs. Barton led the way upstairs to a pleasantly appointed room decorated in soft blues and creams. Mrs. Carrington Blake spent most of her mornings here, attending to correspondence and such. "Shall I leave you to it?" "Thank you. Yes, I won't be long." When the housekeeper had departed, Miss Marple began a careful examination of the room. What she was looking for, she wasn't entirely certain. Something that might reveal the purpose of the key Elaine had taken from her husband's body. Caroline Withers had described it as small, possibly a desk or cabinet key rather than something for a door. The sitting room contained a delicate writing desk, several bookshelves, a comfortable chaise longue, and a cabinet that, upon inspection, contained various bottles of medicine and tonics. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nor did any of the locks appear to match the description of the key. Miss Marple was about to give up when her gaze fell upon a photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed Elaine in skiing attire, smiling against a backdrop of snow-covered mountains. The frame was silver, similar to the one that had contained the photograph of Valerie's mother in the metal box from the rose garden. On a hunch, Miss Marple examined the back of the frame. It appeared solid, but when she pressed lightly on one corner, a small compartment sprang open, revealing a hidden space. Inside was a folded document and what appeared to be a safe deposit box key. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "So that's what you were after, Mrs. Carrington Blake." She carefully unfolded the document, which proved to be a letter from a Swiss bank, acknowledging the establishment of a numbered account. The letter was dated 3 years ago and addressed to Elaine Carrington Blake personally, not jointly with her husband. At the bottom was a handwritten note in what Miss Marple recognized as Richard's precise script. "For emergencies only." The implications were clear. Richard had established a separate account for his wife, a safety net of sorts, but had apparently kept the key to accessing it on his person. When he died, Elaine's first thought had been to secure this key. Just as Miss Marple was replacing the document and key in their hiding place, she heard a soft sound behind her. Turning, she found Perseus sitting in the doorway, watching her, with unblinking amber eyes. "Hello there," she said softly. "I was wondering where you'd got to." The cat regarded her silently for a moment, then walked into the room with deliberate steps, pausing at a small footstool near the fireplace. He pawed at it insistently, as if trying to draw her attention. "What is it?" Miss Marple asked, approaching. "The stool." Upon closer inspection, she noticed that one corner of the needlepoint covering was slightly loose. Gently lifting it, she discovered a small notebook tucked into the stuffing beneath. The notebook was filled with entries in Elaine's elegant handwriting, dates going back several years. It appeared to be a diary. Miss Marple hesitated. Reading someone's private diary seemed an uncomfortable intrusion, even in service of solving a murder. But Perseus continued to stare at her expectantly, and she reminded herself that ordinary social niceties sometimes had to be set aside in extraordinary circumstances. The entries were sporadic, clearly written during moments of particular emotional significance rather than as a daily record. Miss Marple turned to the entries from 6 months ago, around the time of Valerie's arrival. April 15th. A young woman claiming to be Richard's niece has appeared. He's in a state of shock, but seems almost relieved. Says he's been expecting something like this for years. I don't understand. He's never mentioned a niece before. April 20th. Richard finally told me the truth about his past. Michael Saunders, the embezzlement, the accident that killed his sister-in-law. I feel as if I've been married to a stranger all these years. Yet, strangely, I'm not as angry as I should be. Perhaps because I've had my own secrets. Miss Marple turned the page, her interest deepening. May the 3rd. Richard has agreed to pay Valerie a substantial sum. He says it's the right thing to do, a way to make amends. I worry about what this will mean for our finances, but he assures me everything is arranged. He's been spending hours in his study with all those financial documents. May 10th. Received a strange telephone call today from a man claiming to be an old associate of Richard's. He wished to discuss matters of mutual concern. I told Richard, who became extremely agitated and insisted I have nothing to do with the caller, said he would handle it. The entries continued, documenting Elaine's increasing concern about her husband's behaviour, his late nights in the study, and his obsession with the rose garden. Then, 2 weeks before the murder, a particularly disturbing entry. June 5th. Richard showed me the safe deposit box key today. Said if anything happened to him, I was to use it immediately. When I asked what he meant, he just said he'd made enemies by correcting past mistakes. I'm frightened now. What has he done? What is he planning to do? The final entry was dated the day of Richard's death, June 18th. I can't believe what I've agreed to. God forgive me, but I see no other way out. Richard suspects nothing. He trusts me completely, which makes this all the more terrible. But I've gone too far to turn back now. May this all be over quickly. Miss Marple closed the diary, slowly, feeling a profound sadness. The entries confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Elaine's involvement in her husband's death had been more complicated, and more deliberate than she had admitted. Perseus, having accomplished his apparent mission, was now methodically grooming, himself on the chaise longue, seeming entirely unconcerned with Miss Marple's discovery. "You're a very clever cat," she told him softly, "but I wonder if even you understand the full complexity of human motivations." She carefully placed the diary in her handbag, intending to give it to Inspector Craddock. As she did so, she noticed a folded newspaper clipping that had been tucked between the final pages. Opening it, she found herself looking at a photograph of a much younger Elaine, standing beside a man who was definitely not Richard Carrington Blake. The caption identified them as Elaine Withers and Brother Charles at the Royal Academy exhibition. "Withers," Miss Marple murmured, the significance immediately apparent. The same surname as Caroline. This final piece clicked into place, completing the pattern that had been forming in Miss Marple's mind. Caroline wasn't just an actress hired by Weatherby. She was Elaine's relative, possibly her niece. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone had realized, with connections that predated Weatherby's reappearance in Richard Carrington Blake's life. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Perseus rose and padded silently to the door, pausing to look back at her expectantly. "Yes, I suppose we should both be going," she agreed. "There are people who need to hear what we've discovered." Together, the elderly detective and the inscrutable cat made their way downstairs, each carrying in their own way the knowledge that would finally bring this complex case to its conclusion. A case that had begun and would end with secrets hidden in plain sight, observed by those patient enough to truly see. Chapter 11. The Family Connection. Inspector Craddock stared at the newspaper clipping Miss Marple had placed before him, his expression a mixture of surprise and growing comprehension. They were seated in Miss Marple's cottage, where the elderly detective had invited him after leaving Danemead. Perseus comfortably installed on a cushion nearby. "Elaine Withers," he said slowly. "And Caroline Withers claimed to be an actress hired by Weatherby." He looked up at Miss Marple. "Are you suggesting they're related?" "More than suggesting, Inspector. I believe it's the final piece that makes sense of this entire case." Miss Marple poured tea for them both, her movements precise and measured. "Consider what we know. Richard Carrington Blake, formerly Michael Saunders, built a new life after the accident that killed his sister-in-law. He acquired wealth, status, and eventually married Elaine, whom he met in Switzerland, where he frequently visited, according to those passport stamps," Craddock added. "Precisely. Now, imagine Elaine's shock when she discovered her husband's true identity. Not just the deception itself, but the specific identity he had assumed." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I believe Elaine knew about Michael Saunders long before Valerie, or rather Caroline, appeared at Danemead. In fact, I suspect she married him knowing exactly who he was." "But why would she do that?" "Revenge, Inspector. A dish best served cold, as they say." Miss Marple's knitting needles appeared in her hands, clicking softly as she spoke. "I've been thinking about family connections. The woman who died in that car accident 20 years ago, Michael Saunders' sister-in-law, what was her name?" Craddock consulted his notes. "Elizabeth Stanwyck. She was married to Saunders' business partner, Harold Stanwyck, and she had a daughter, the real Valerie, who supposedly died 5 years after the accident. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. What if Elizabeth Stanwyck was Elaine's sister? Good Lord, Craddock breathed. You're suggesting that Elaine deliberately sought out and married the man responsible for her sister's death? Without him knowing their connection? It would explain a great deal, Miss Marple nodded. Her apparent lack of surprise when Valerie appeared. Her complicated reaction to the revelation of her husband's true identity. And most significantly, her relationship with Caroline Withers. Her niece, perhaps. Or another relative, I believe. Caroline may be Elizabeth Stanwyck's other daughter. Not Valerie, but a younger sister not mentioned in the original reports. She would have been very young at the time of the accident, possibly too young to be named in news accounts. The inspector was rapidly making notes. We can verify this. Birth records, family connections. He looked up suddenly. But if you're right, that means Elaine has been planning this for years. Meeting Saunders in Switzerland, marrying him, biding her time. A long game indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But her diary suggests the final act was precipitated by something else. Richard had apparently been correcting past mistakes, perhaps making amends in ways that threatened Elaine's plans for retribution. The separate bank account, Craddock mused, and the provision for the cat in his will, both suggest he was preparing for some kind of reckoning. I believe he suspected his wife might not be who she claimed to be, Miss Marple said. Hence the recording device found by Caroline. He was gathering evidence, possibly planning to confront Elaine with his suspicions. Which would explain why she agreed to participate in Weatherby's murder scheme when it was proposed. The inspector shook his head in wonder. It's almost Shakespearean. Revenge, deception, tragic revelations. Human nature changes very little across the centuries, Inspector. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. The desire for vengeance, the capacity for deception, the ability to compartmentalize one's actions, these are constants I've observed throughout my life. Perseus, who had been quietly attentive during this exchange, suddenly stood, stretching luxuriously before padding across to Miss Marple's chair and leaping onto her lap with surprising agility for an animal of his size. "Well," Miss Marple exclaimed, slightly startled but clearly pleased, "it seems Perseus has decided to offer his opinion on our theories." The cat settled comfortably, fixing Craddock with his inscrutable amber gaze. He does seem to have a knack for inserting himself at crucial moments, the inspector observed wryly, much like his new guardian. Miss Marple smiled, gently stroking the cat's silky fur. "I've been thinking about that provision in Richard's will, the one leaving Perseus and the substantial sum to the person who discovers the truth about my death. It suggests he anticipated being murdered, but also that he believed someone would care enough to investigate properly. Someone like you, Miss Marple. Perhaps. Or perhaps he simply trusted that truth has a way of emerging, given time and careful observation." She glanced down at Perseus. He ensured his most faithful companion would be there to witness whatever unfolded. "Speaking of witnessing," Craddock said, returning to business, "we need to interview Elaine Carrington Blake again with this new information. And Caroline Withers. She's clearly been withholding crucial details about her relationship to Elaine. I suspect Caroline's role may be more complicated than we initially thought," Miss Marple suggested. "Her actions at Danemead that night, returning to check on what Weatherby had done, Securing the recording suggests a person conflicted about her part in the conspiracy. Conflicted or not, she participated in a murder plot, Craddock pointed out, as did Elaine, regardless of her motivations. Oh, I'm not suggesting either should escape the consequences of their actions, Inspector. Justice must be served. Miss Marple's expression grew serious. But understanding the full truth matters as well, especially when so many lives have been damaged by deception. Their conversation was interrupted by the telephone ringing. Miss Marple excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. That was Dr. Haydock, she informed Craddock. Elaine Carrington Blake has taken a turn for the worse. Her heart condition is apparently more serious than initially diagnosed. He's not certain she'll recover. Craddock stood immediately. I need to get to the hospital. If she dies before making a full statement, I'll accompany you, Miss Marple decided, gently displacing Perseus from her lap. There are questions only Elaine can answer, and they cannot wait. The cat watched them prepare to leave, his tail twitching slightly, as if signalling his disapproval at being left behind. I believe Perseus should come with us, Miss Marple said, suddenly. His presence might prove illuminating. Craddock raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. In his experience, Miss Marple's seemingly eccentric suggestions often had sound reasoning behind them. 20 minutes later, the unusual trio arrived at Milechester General Hospital. An elderly lady, a police inspector, and a carrier containing a somewhat disgruntled Persian cat. They were met by Dr. Haydock, who led them toward the private room, where Elaine Carrington Blake lay connected to various monitoring devices, her complexion alarmingly pale against the white hospital linens. She's been asking for you, Jane, Dr. Haydock murmured. Seems quite agitated about something. I've given her a mild sedative, but her heart rate remains elevated. Whatever she wants to tell you, it might be best to hear it quickly. As they entered the room, Elaine's eyes fluttered, open. Her gaze moved from Miss Marple to Inspector Craddock, then widened as it fell upon the cat carrier. You've brought Perseus, she whispered, her voice barely audible. How appropriate. The witness to my greatest triumph and my ultimate failure. Mrs. Carrington Blake, Craddock began formally, we have some questions regarding your relationship with Caroline Withers and your connection to Elizabeth Stanwyck. A faint smile touched Elaine's lips. So, you've figured it out? Or rather, she has. Her gaze shifted to Miss Marple. I wondered how long it would take. The old lady who sees everything, just like that damned cat. Elizabeth was your sister, Miss Marple said gently. That's why you married Michael Saunders after he became Richard Carrington Blake. Not for love or money, but for revenge. 20 years, Elaine whispered. 20 years planning, waiting. He killed Lizzie, drove off that bridge deliberately, left her daughter, my niece, crippled, and then he just disappeared, started over. Built a new life while we buried Lizzie, and watched Valerie suffer through operation after operation. The real Valerie did die then? Craddock asked. When she was 13. Complications from her injuries. That's when I knew I couldn't just find Michael Saunders. I had to destroy him completely. Make him suffer as we had suffered. Miss Marple moved closer to the bed. And Caroline, she's your younger niece, isn't she? Elizabeth's second daughter. Elaine's eyes filled with tears. Caroline was only 3 when the accident happened. Too young to remember her mother or the life they'd had. I raised her afterward when her father collapsed into alcoholism. She became an actress because Lizzie had been one before her marriage. So, when you finally located Michael Saunders, I created a new identity too, Elaine confirmed, a hint of pride entering her voice despite her weakened state. Researched his movements, his business trips, made sure to be in the right place at the right time. The perfect coincidence. He never suspected I knew who he really was. Perseus had begun making small, insistent sounds from within his carrier. Miss Marple unlatched the door, allowing him to emerge. To everyone's surprise, the cat leapt gracefully onto Elaine's bed, settling near her feet, watching her with those unblinking amber eyes. "He always knew," Elaine murmured, looking at the cat. "Somehow, he always knew I wasn't who I claimed to be. Richard thought it was just animal antipathy, but it was more than that. Animals sense deception, truth. They can't be fooled the way humans can." "And the murder?" Craddock prompted. "Weatherby's role?" "A convenient tool," Elaine whispered, her strength visibly fading. "He contacted me after Caroline made her appearance as Valerie. Said he'd recognized me from photographs in the financial pages, knew exactly who I was and why I'd married Richard. Proposed a partnership. But things didn't go according to plan," Miss Marple observed. "Richard was changing," Elaine admitted. "After Caroline arrived, claiming to be Valerie, something shifted in him. He became remorseful. Started moving money around, setting up accounts. That's when I found the recording device in his study. Realized he was gathering evidence. Against me, against Weatherby. He'd guessed, you see. Not everything, but enough." Her breathing had become laboured, and Dr. Haydock moved forward with concern, checking the monitors beside her bed. "I think that's enough for now," he began, but Elaine raised a weak hand to stop him. "No, I need to finish, need her to understand." Her gaze fixed on Miss Marple. "It was supposed to be simple. Justice for Lizzie, for Valerie, but in the end—" Her voice faltered. "In the end," Miss Marple finished gently, "you discovered that revenge, however meticulously planned, rarely brings the satisfaction one expects." A single tear slid down Elaine's cheek. "He loved that cat more than he ever loved me. Left it a fortune and a protector. Made sure it would be cared for after he was gone. Why couldn't he have shown such consideration for Lizzie? For Valerie? Perseus moved suddenly, creeping up the bed until he was near Elaine's hand. To everyone's astonishment, he nudged her fingers gently with his head. "Well," Elaine whispered, a strange mix of bitterness and wonder in her voice, "it seems even Perseus has found it in his heart to forgive me. How ironic." Her eyes began to close, exhaustion overtaking her. Dr. Haydock gestured for Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock to leave, but as they turned to go, Elaine spoke once more, her voice barely audible. "The key. Did you find it?" "Yes," Miss Marple acknowledged. "The key to the Swiss account." "Not for me," Elaine murmured. "For Caroline. My last gift to her. For when this is all over." As they left the room, Perseus following with surprising docility, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled web of deception, revenge, and unexpected compassion that had characterized this most unusual case. The cat who had witnessed everything had, in his own inscrutable way, brought the final pieces of truth to light. A silent observer who had seen beyond the masks humans wore so convincingly, even to themselves.